Legislative Resolution number 3550 by Senator Ritchie, memorializing Governor Andrew M. Cuomo to proclaim February 2nd, 2016 as Canada, Quebec, Ontario Day in the state of New York. Whereas, Canada is New York's primary export market with $34.2 billion worth of merchandise goods exchanged as 17% of New York's worldwide exports sold to Canada in 2014. In addition, 680,900 New York jobs are supported by Canada-U.S. trade. And whereas New York and Canada share an international border measuring 445 miles in length with 17 international border crossings, featuring several important international trade corridors, including the Quebec-New York corridor, the Capital Corridor, and Continental One, as well as the second busiest crossing between Canada and the United States at the Peace Bridge. And whereas the New York-Canada Partnership boasts the largest bilateral tourism industry in the United States with over 6.9 million Canadian visiting New York, accounting for over $1.7 billion in expenditures in 2012. And whereas reflective of the strong security relationship, the Eastern Air Defense Sector, headquartered in Rome, New York, is staffed by active-duty New York Air National Guardsmen and a Canadian Forces detachment. This unit supports NORAD's integrated warning and attack assessment mission and the U.S. Northern Command's Homeland Defense mission. And whereas over 19 million New Yorkers depend on Canada and its vast energy reserves to fuel our state, importing over $4.7 billion worth of energy from Canada in 2014. And whereas Quebec, more specifically, has been an important supplier of clean, renewable energy to New York for decades. And whereas New York is the primary international market for Quebec, with a total value of bilateral trade amounting to $7.4 billion in 2014, and exports to New York represent 11.5% of Quebec's U.S.-bound exports, with an emphasis on unwrought aluminum, petroleum products, refined copper, and hydroelectricity. And whereas Quebec established the first office abroad in 1940 in New York City and has maintained this important commercial investment, educational, and cultural link to New York and neighboring states for 75 years. And whereas financial ties between Quebec and New York go back almost a century and a half, when Quebec became the first foreign issuer of bonds on Wall Street in 1879. And whereas Ontario and New York are closely linked geographically, both bordering on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and having border crossing points in the Niagara and St. Lawrence regions. And the jurisdictions have in common a significant number of economic, social, environmental, educational, and cultural interests and connections. And whereas more than 63% of Canada's total bilateral trade with New York was between Ontario and New York, with Ontario's primary exports to New York including unwrought gold and silver, engines, autos, and electrical energy, and Ontario's primary imports from New York including petroleum gases, metals, motor vehicle parts, and engines. And whereas the economies of Ontario and New York are tightly linked through integrated cross-border supply chains that keep our firms competitive, including, for example, auto parts that cross the border sometimes several times before completion. And whereas Canada, and in particular its provinces Quebec and Ontario, and New York share many deep economic, historical, cultural, and familial ties, as well, now therefore be it resolved that this legislative body pause its deliberations to memorialize Governor Andrew M. Cuomo to proclaim February 2nd, 2016 as Canada, Quebec, Ontario Day in the state of New York, and be it further resolved that copies of this resolution suitably engrossed be transmitted to the Honorable Andrew M. Cuomo, Governor of the State of New York, the Consulate General of Canada in New York, the Quebec Government Office in New York, and the Office of the Ontario Government Representative in Washington, D.C.
Senator Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor and the privilege to welcome representatives of the Canadian, Ontario, and Quebec governments to our chambers today. I'd like to take a moment just to recognize a few. Mr. John Prado, Consul General of Canada in New York, Mr. Jean-Claude Lauzon, Delegate General of Quebec Government in New York, and Ms. Monique Smith, Ontario Provincial Representative to the United States. I want to welcome you all today. I know many of my colleagues are always surprised when they find out that it takes me about 4.5 hours to get to the capital of New York where I work. But I can get to the nation's capital in Canada in less than an hour. So I think people are really kind of amazed at that. And I know living and growing up so close to the border, I think it's given me a different perspective. I know when my kids were playing hockey when they were young, if our local arena was full and we didn't want to drive 20 miles to the next community in New York, we would think nothing of jumping in the car and going to practice a couple miles over the border in Canada. And so I've always been keenly aware of the wonderful honor it is to be able to live and share the relationship with the Canadians across the border. Because of that, I've been able to kind of keep track of the traffic, the Canadian plates on the road, but I'm even more keenly aware of it now as the senator who represents 175 miles of border along the St. Lawrence River in Ontario. And so the economics between the Canadians and the New Yorkers, especially in my district, is something that's extremely important to our local economy, but it's extremely important to New York as a whole, as Canada is our #1 trading partner. So I want to thank all of you for coming here today, to sending your message and letting us all know how important our relationship is. And I certainly appreciate the friendship we've had hundreds of years between the Canadians and New Yorkers, and look forward to working with all of you in the future. And I'd like to extend the invitation to my colleagues to come to my district, and we'll take a couple minutes just to drive across the border and see what not only my district has to offer, but what yours does also. So thank you again, and it's an honor and a privilege to have you here with us today. Thank you, Mr. President.